Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited to welcome you here today to the third and final AYAC election forum. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. Ngunnawal country is where I'm joining you today. We also acknowledge the traditional owners of country from where you're joining us today. We pay our respects to the elders, both past and present, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us during this event. My name is Caitlin Figueiredo and I'm the co-chair of the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition. We are the national voice and advocate body for more than 4.5 million young people from across the country. AYAC is hosting these events with representatives from the major parties so you can hear about what they will do for young people and ask questions before you vote. We're joined by an Auslan interpreter at this event who you can see on screen. If you need help or support during the event, just use the chat button and one of our team will help you out. So we're joined tonight by Shadow Minister Amanda Rishworth from the Australian Labor Party. Hi, Amanda. So Amanda is the member for Kingston in South Australia and was first elected to the Australian Federal Parliament in 2007. Amanda is currently the Shadow Minister for Youth and Early Childhood Education and Development. We're really excited to hear from you, Amanda, and I want to thank you so much for your continuing support of AYAC and of young people across Australia. So we're going to take some questions from the audience in just a moment, but first, we'd like you, Amanda, to share why you believe young Australians should vote for Labor at this Saturday's election. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. And I would like to acknowledge that I am on Kaurna land on the Adelaide Plains, and I respect the elders past, present, and of course our leaders that are emerging. And say a big hello to everyone and thank the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition for organising these forums. They are incredibly important. I would first say, as Shadow Minister for Youth, I've had an absolute privilege of hearing from thousands of young Australians about their views, their ideas, and I'd like to also acknowledge that I've heard a lot from young Australians about what the roadblocks that are in their way of participating. And so I think often we point out as young people as leaders of the future, but I think it needs to be acknowledged tonight that young people are contributing in so many different ways in our economy, in civic society, in your own communities. And I think the first commitment I would make if Labor is elected and if I'm the Minister for Youth is I take that contribution incredibly seriously. I understand the contributions you're making and I want to hear from you, and you will have in me, if I am lucky enough to be the Minister for Youth, someone that doesn't see it as an add-on, doesn't see it as something that's just something on the side, but something I take very, very seriously and are committed to. And I am also very proud that the Labor Party has put forward a range of policies that have been future focused, that are squarely looking at how we can deliver a better future for this country. The first issue that a lot of young people speak to me about, and I know is on many of your minds, is about taking strong action on climate change. And despite some of the glib lines out there, the Labor Party's policy is about taking strong action on climate change. We've committed to an interim target when it comes to climate change of 43% and by 2030 reduction. And of course, that net zero by 2050. In addition, we've talked about making electric cars cheaper, about rewiring the grid so more renewables can come online. This is an exciting prospect of how we actually transition our economy, because the climate emergency is our jobs opportunity. And the more we say that and the more we deliver on that, the more I think we can bring our whole community along. Of course, in addition, education is an issue that is brought up about what type of job people are going to get and what their future looks like. And I'm really, really proud that Labor has put forward a range of different policies in the education space, most notably looking at close to 500,000 TAFE positions, free TAFE positions that young people can take up in areas of workforce shortage. And this is, I think, really, really important. And in addition, we've said we'll have more than 20,000 extra university places and 10,000 new energy apprentices to train and work in the new energy jobs of the future. And also a very, very exciting announcement that I made yesterday is that we need to do things differently when it comes to young people's careers. We need to ensure that the careers don't start off with lots of casual work and no long-term career planning. That's why I was really pleased to announce yesterday that a Labor government will partner with Y Australia to invest $15.2 million to establish the Y Care Careers to create secure employment for young Australians in the care economy. When I talk to young people, I hear a lot about the barriers that young people have when they look at a career in the care economy. The shift work, the irregular hours, the juggling of multiple employers, hard to get regular hours each week, the need to train, obtain different qualifications, whilst also having multiple superannuation accounts and a lack of visible career path. The Y Care Careers will dismantle these barriers and create real opportunity and putting practical and immediate support for young Australians, those that are, and of course, train them up to deliver care jobs, care services in our economy. And this is really important because there's actually a shortage of care workers in our economy at the moment. So this is about addressing youth unemployment, underemployment, but also actually working on career opportunities for young people, not just jobs. Finally, I also wanted to touch on where I see and where the Labor Party sees the role of young people in our democracy. I think for too long, the Commonwealth has not directly engaged with young people and sought feedback, engagement, not only on the issues that are important, but detailed feedback on policy design. And I often go to the PATH program as an example. The PATH program and the internships within the PATH program, if they had been actually listened to or what young people thought about, that program would never have got off the ground because it wasn't what young people wanted. They didn't want an internship in a supermarket, perhaps, that paid extra $50 on top of JobSeeker. That is not what young people are calling out for. So it's no wonder that that plan actually failed. So I said that I would be very committed, and we've announced already, to a proper youth engagement model with younger Australians having a direct engagement with government. I've also committed to saying that Labor will establish an office for youth because there's no use in having lots of advocacy if there's no one in government to listen. And that's why an office for youth is so important, and that's why a minister for youth is so important, which is what I've committed to as well. Now, these are really, really important mechanisms, I believe. Now, I haven't got all the details because I do want to make sure that this youth engagement model is co-designed. So if we're elected, I will work with many organisations and young people to co-design it, to make sure it's representative, to make sure there's a diversity of voices able to have a say as part of this. I think that's really important. Now, I think it's really also important to acknowledge that we've got so much more to do. And I think even prior to this pandemic, younger Australians were at risk of being the first generation to be actually worse off than their parents. We have this sort of code, I think, an unwritten code that says young people, that the current generation should make sure the next generation is better off. Well, we're at risk of losing that, and the pandemic has exacerbated that. So what I am, and when we look at, for example, insecure work, significant barriers to education, training, social inclusion and mental health, all these things have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So we need to address this. The Morrison government's National Youth Policy Framework has failed. It was a shopping list of policies already announced. It wasn't a plan for the future. So I'm really pleased to announce tonight that if Labor's elected, we will put together a youth recovery strategy from the pandemic. This will be genuinely co-designed with young people, include comprehensive consideration of how various departments and policy areas interact and impact young people, and outline short-term, medium-term and long-term targets and goals so that they actually can be measured, so that young people can hold a Labor government to account on the progress that we're making when it comes to our recovery from the pandemic. It is no doubt that that young people have been hit the hardest, so the attention of government must be truly focused in the recovery. So finally, I'll just say that the youth recovery strategy is building on our commitment about a youth engagement model, implementing an office for youth, having a minister for youth, because if we don't listen to young Australians, the truth is not only will they feel disengaged in our democracy, but government won't get policy right for young Australians. And if I'm elected, and I know Labor is very keen to make sure we get our policy right for young Australians. And the only way to do that is to make sure that we are listening to the voices of young Australians. So Caitlin, I might leave it there. That's my pitch, but I know we're going to get to questions and answers, which I'm very much engaged. I look forward to engaging with.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Honestly, I think every young person right now was really engaged by your speech, and I'm sure the chat is going to blow up to ask heaps of questions. But before that, I would like to introduce everyone to the wonderful Luke from AYAC, who will share some questions that have already been sent in by the audience. Luke, over to you.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Amanda. It's really, really great to hear about that speech. And hi to everyone watching. If you would like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature down in the bottom of the toolbar, or to pop them in the chat. And if you want to, you can send those questions to us privately as well. Amanda, just quickly, it's really exciting to hear about a youth recovery plan. Can you share maybe a little bit more about possible timelines or how you might approach that, knowing that for a lot of young people, the pandemic's hit them really, really hard. And as we come out of the first phase of that pandemic, that timeline's going to be really important.
Yeah, look, it is really important. I think we need to, because it will be cross-government agency, we will need to obviously get elected and work on that relatively quickly. But I do want this to be not just a short-term strategy. As I mentioned, I think there needs to be short-term, medium-term and long-term goals in that. In terms of consultation, I think there needs to be proper consultation about the impact of COVID and getting a clear understanding. So it's about finding the balance, I think, between consultation, listening, and then putting some concrete goals down with some targets and accountability. So look, I would envisage we get started on that as quickly as we can, because this is the point where we're recovering, although I will acknowledge we're not out of COVID yet. There is still a lot of impacts at the moment, different from perhaps what they were last year, different from the year before, but we do need to get on and do that work as quickly as possible, but keeping balancing, making that consultation broad so that we get the goals at the outset right.
Thanks, Amanda. That's really exciting. I know a lot of people have been asking for a recovery plan for a really long time now for young people. So that's really great. And I think everyone on the call will be really looking forward to working with your team to do that. I'm going to jump into the questions now. For everyone listening, we had a lot of pre-submitted questions that came in when people registered. And the first one is about cost of living. We recently ran a poll. We asked more than 500 young people across the country, what's the number one issue for you when you hit the polls on Saturday on election day? And cost of living was number one. So what will your party do to address cost of living increases for young people?
Yeah. Look, thank you very much for that question, because cost of living is really, really difficult for many young people. So I guess there's two elements to the cost of living question. The first is Labor's put out some policies to help drive down the cost of living for certain things that we subsidise. So medicines, Medicare, healthcare, we've now announced a range of policies that would help with the increasing costs of healthcare. Our climate change policy, we believe, will drive down the cost of power bills and deliver cheaper power. And also childcare. While not a lot of young people access childcare, if we're looking into the long term, accessing childcare, we have got a plan to drive those down. But in addition to that, we've got to look at secure, well-paid jobs, because if we are not having wage increases, if we're having people living week to week on hours, then those direct cost of living, reductions are not going to mean anything if people cannot get that secure work. So we've announced a range of policies in the industrial relations space to deal with pay and conditions. Particularly, I think some of the ones that would be quite interested to young people involve, for example, making new rules and treating gig work as employee-like work. So actually allowing some of the pay and conditions, including the minimum wage, to be connected with gig work, to have a definition of what casual actually means. I mean, I worked as a casual for 5 years straight in retail, and I was then able to be dismissed quite easily. So having a proper definition, what is actually really casual work and what is being called casual work but actually permanent, and some other stuff around same job, same pay, that if you're there with labour hire and you're doing the same job as someone else, you should get paid the same amount. Gender pay equity, actually putting that as a principle in the Fair Work Act. So while some of the cost of living issues we can help with direct payments, and there are other cost of living issues that must be dealt with actually driving up wages and conditions, and particularly for our lowest paid workers. And I won't shirk away from saying that the minimum wage needs to keep up with the cost of living.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. I think it's really good how you touched on like multifaceted elements that are affecting young people, which is fantastic. So something that we're going to move on to the next question, and I know you've touched on it regarding Labor's climate change policies, because that's a vital issue for young people. We actually received a lot of questions around the climate crisis, but one in particular I'd just like to pose to you. It's from one of the attendees here today. So they say that the climate change targets of the major parties aren't very different, with the exception of investment in renewable energy, which you've touched on. What other plans do you have to take serious action on climate change? And if you win government, when can we expect to see this implementation?
Yeah, well, look, I would disagree with the premise of the question, just because the Liberal Party doesn't have an interim target. Or they do. It's the Paris a target of 28 to 35%. I mean, that's their interim target by 2030. And there's absolutely no plan to actually get there. So we've seen emissions, without COVID, we would have seen emissions continue to rise as they had since the abolition of the price on carbon. So we need to deal with this. We have a 43% reduction by 2030, keeping in mind that's only 7 years away, or eight, depending on when the election happens. So it is not long to go to reach that 43% target. So it's going to need a lot of investment in renewable energies. It's going to need our largest polluters to reduce their pollution to meet that target, which we've committed to. And it also will involve bringing a lot of renewable energy onto the grid. The Liberal Party doesn't have a plan about how to bring that renewable energy onto the grid. And that's why we're talking about an investment. I just want to get the number right, $20 billion of investment into the grid to bring renewables on so they can actually be used and become a staple source of energy. So that plan is, I think, a very comprehensive plan with our then net zero by 2050. But we've also talked a lot about electric cars and about how we facilitate electric cars into the market, looking at incentives around tax, looking at recharging infrastructure. It's all going to be really important. One of the things, obviously, last election, electric cars, we were told would end the weekend. Of course, what we actually know, and we knew it then and we know it now, is if we don't start putting the infrastructure in place and start that transition to electric cars, we're going to end up with the old cars that no one else wants because the major car companies are moving. So I think we've got a range of different policies. As I mentioned, our new energy apprenticeships, talking about those jobs into the future. So I feel like we've got a significant package here that's credible that can get us to those targets, because it's all well and good to have targets, but if you don't have a plan to get there, it doesn't mean anything.
Thanks, Amanda. And I know that climate change was the number 2 issue that people noted they were going to vote on. So I think that answer is really important for people making a decision right now. Our next question's on housing affordability, which is really, really important. It's been a focus of the election campaign over the past 5 or 6 days. What are your plans for resolving the housing crisis and to make renting and purchasing properties more affordable for young people?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, there is no silver bullet when it comes to housing affordability. We've put forward what we think are some really responsible, important initiatives that don't involve making young people choose between their being comfortable in retirement or being able to buy a house now. And I think personally, and the most irresponsible policy that I've seen has been the Liberal Party's policy around superannuation and being able to withdraw that superannuation and giving people that difficult choice between, am I going to withdraw it now and not have enough super? So what I do think, though, we've made a number of commitments. The first is around a long-term plan called our Housing Australia Future Fund. And that is an investment fund that the returns we will be investing into public housing and affordable housing. And I think you've got to start at the most affordable, I wouldn't say affordable end, but where the need is most acute, and public housing and making public housing available to people. I know there's people waiting for a year in the biggest crisis to get public housing. So we've got to start with public housing and affordable housing. And so that is a really important part of the package. And that's a long-term plan that will invest year on year on year. So while it might not, all the houses aren't going to come online immediately, this is something very long-term. And I think having long-term plans is really important. Second thing that we've said is we will have what's called a Help to Buy plan, which will help people buy their homes sooner with what's called a shared equity scheme. There's a shared equity scheme that currently runs in Victoria and West Australia, where for those on lower incomes, it will mean they'll need less of a deposit and less of it, only need to require a smaller amount of equity and mortgage to service, because they will share that with the government. It's been some scare campaigns about government owning your home. Well, it's only people that want to do this that actually participate in it, and it would help about 10,000 Australians every year. And then we've also said we'll create a regional first home buyers support scheme to help 10,000 Australian families in regional areas buy their first home. And this is an important piece of the puzzle. So these are a number of different things we think are responsible and don't have that inflationary pressure on houses. That is something you've got to really marry up demand and supply in the housing market. So it is a really big challenge, but we will continue to work on it.
Thanks for that answer, Amanda. And I should say that one of our good friends and members, the National Youth Commission and Youth Development Australia, have just released a really long and good policy document with some options to address the housing crisis and a range of policy options to also focus in on that supply side, which is really, really great. Caitlin,
and sorry, I'll just add that would be, I would see this as a key part of the youth recovery strategy, housing and housing affordability.
Amazing. That's great to hear. And I think a lot of people really appreciate that. Caitlin, I might hand over to you for the next one.
Stable, because I'm getting messages that it's not, so hopefully this question comes through. So Amanda, what will you and the Labor government do to address the mental health pandemic and increase access of mental health services for young people across Australia?
Yeah, look, it's a huge issue. I used to work as a psychologist and before I was in Parliament in my previous life, and this is a really big issue. One of the things we've announced is a $200 million for student wellbeing support in the classrooms, because we know that mental health issues are presenting younger and younger, and there's a lot of teachers that feel ill-equipped really to deal with these issues. And so I've got two friends that are student welfare officers, and they're really burnt out. They are really burnt out. And so we need to be intervening earlier. We need to be picking these young people up earlier, because I definitely know it's harder. The further you're down in the ditch, the harder it is to get back out. So if we can get in a bit earlier. So look, we are going to invest with more school counsellors, psychologists, and extra funding for camps, excursions, and other activities that help with wellbeing. So once again, early intervention and prevention in our schools is really important, and also develop a voluntary mental health tool so that in primary school, because we know students are presenting earlier, primary school students can get the extra help they need and be identified, because a primary school student does present differently to a high school student when it comes to mental health wellbeing. So we think that's really important. We've also announced the reinstatement of the telehealth mental health loading for regional consults. This is we're going to keep the telehealth, that's shown to be really good, but the regional consults are really important. So we're going to keep that extra loading, which was scrapped. But I think continuing to work on how we deliver services is also really important. But we have to balance that prevention and early intervention with acute services. Finding that balance is really difficult.
Thanks, Amanda. And not to talk about another set of policy documents, but our friends at Origin, with ourselves and Batyr and Reach Out and other organisations, Mission Australia, have put out a policy document with some options on mental health. So I'd encourage everyone watching to go and find that.
And it's a very good one.
Yes, thank you. Our next question's on making university more affordable. What plans do you have to make uni more affordable for young people? And have you considered, I love a specific policy question, have you considered resetting HECS repayments thresholds back to an earlier setting to take the pressure off young people's budgets?
Yeah, look, the decision around the changes in 2017, and there's been other changes as well, has made it really expensive. Look, this is an issue that I'm very aware of. We don't have a specific plan. As you've identified, there are many things that if Labor's elected, we need to turn around. One of the things we have said, though, is that we do really want to, increase the number of places at universities. So we've announced an extra 20,000 extra university places over 22-23, because there has been, through the pandemic, whether that's been a recalibration of young people wanting to choose a different path, been increase in demand. But we have also said we want to establish an Australian Universities Accord to trust lasting reform in our universities. I think the Accord is about working with universities to, and it's a two-way partnership, to deliver accessibility, affordability, quality, certainty, sustainability and prosperity. I think what COVID's shown is not only have the changes that will be made more expensive, but I think the precarious nature for universities and the reliance on overseas students, and when that was taken away during the pandemic, showed a lot of vulnerabilities. So our commitment to that wholesale accord with universities is, I think, really important, and a real important partnership going forward.
Thanks, Amanda. And I'm glad you mentioned international students. We work with a lot of young people who are international students. They've been hit really, really hard during the pandemic. And I think as part of any recovery, we need to have a greater focus on international students and their really difficult experience over the last couple of years. Another question's come in on HECS debt, which I love as someone with a really big HECS debt, unfortunately, after a few too many degrees. Would the ALP support any plans to scrap HECS debts?
Yeah, look, we're not planning that at this stage. HECS, look, I understand the HECS debts are huge. I paid HECS, so I'm one of the politicians that didn't get their university for free. And I also paid, I mean, that's what got me involved in politics. But at this point, there are huge competing priorities on the budget at the moment. And when we look at some of the areas in my other portfolio of early childhood education and the investment we need to make there to provide gender equity in this country, and also investment in early education, if we look at our aged care system, which is falling apart and has been neglected by the government, there are so many competing priorities. If we look at some of the other issues around TAFE, our free TAFE places, our investment in climate change, that there are huge priorities. So look, I'll be honest, and that's not something that we're looking at on our agenda.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. The next question we have on our list is about people with disabilities and their representation. And the question from this young person was, how can we embed people with disabilities within policy development, either through the policy mechanisms you've been speaking about or more broadly in government, in the spirit of nothing about us without us? Yeah,
look, it's an excellent question. And I think it goes similar discussions we've had with about young people being involved. So the intersectionality around young people and these different areas will be in the youth recovery strategy. And so the intersectionality of disability will be in that, but it needs to also be within the National Disability Strategy. What we've said is we would like to see some more accountability with the implementation of the National Disability Strategy, so that people within the community can hold government to account with the National Disability Strategy. We need to see much more involvement with people living with a disability and their family and carers involved in any reforms in the NDIS. I think they've disappeared from the centre of the NDIS, which is what was envisaged. And so I know that Bill Shorten has spoken about that a lot, about ensuring that there are, whether it's the board, more people with lived experience, whether it is any changes. And we actually need to, one of our commitments is actually collecting information and data on people's experiences and actually reflecting on it and have an evidence base to actually build from that as well. And that involves engaging with people with a disability. So there is absolutely no doubt that the NDIS has gotten off track, and I hear over and over just how much they've been left out. Another policy we've also talked about, which I think is really important, is an autism strategy or autism plan. I hear, obviously there's a lot of focus on young people, children with autism, but those children grow up, and how are we creating an environment for neurodiverse young people and older people as they move through? They're not visible at the moment. It's a real concern. So as we move through, as children have experienced the NDIS, how do we support young people and as they get older living with autism as well? So that's some of the areas that we do want to focus on. But it's no doubt that people living with a disability and their family and their carers need to be engaged along the whole way.
Thanks, Amanda. And we had a comment from someone that came in that was addressed to all the parties, imploring everyone to appoint more people with disability to the NDIA board and to the NDIS structure, which is super exciting. Wasn't as much of a question, but I really love that approach, which is great. I've got another question from a group called Think Forward, which I think you know. Think Forward, for everyone that's listening, are a coalition of youth organisations and young people around the country calling for a parliamentary inquiry into intergenerational fairness. If elected, will you work with young people to address intergenerational inequality in the economy, and how might you do that?
Yeah, look, I think I've been briefed on the parliamentary inquiry, and I'm very interested, if I am elected as the Minister for Youth, to talk about how that inquiry might fit with the youth recovery strategy, because obviously the youth recovery strategy is a long piece of work, and whether there's a role where that fits along with our existing intergenerational report. I know, hearing from people the frustration that, and particularly young people, that the intergenerational report gets released and then sits somewhere and gathers dust. It's actually a really, really important report that highlights the intergenerational unfairness. It collects a huge amount of information, but of course probably doesn't have voices in there. So how do we get these things working together along with our long-term plan for a direct engagement structure? So I guess my question is, I'm absolutely committed to work out how a parliamentary inquiry would work with those other commitments that we've made and the existing structures in place, because I don't want it repeating, because then it gets ignored or is really got to complement. But if we can find a way to complement all these things together, then that'll be great. And how it feeds in, maybe it feeds into the recovery strategy, but we've got to work in how that all works together. But definitely, anything that can shine a light on that intergenerational issue is really important, because, as I said, we are at risk of having our first generation that does worse than their parents. And so we've got to have a focus on that.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. It's really great to hear you say that. Even just that last line, I think being able to say that these days is really, really important, because I don't think that's what we want to do as a country. But thank you. I really appreciate that. And to be honest, I know it might sound a bit boring, but everyone I know loves talking about tax policy. A lot of our members love talking about tax policy and how we make things more fair. So that's really exciting. But I'll stop saying tax and hand back to Caitlin.
Cool. Thanks, Amanda. I think our friends at Think Forward would be really happy to hear you say that you'd support an inquiry. So now the final question would be around the voting age. So young people, as you know, under the age of 18 currently can't vote in their own interests. Do you support lowering the voting age to 16, or coming up with another way to support young people to be engaged?
Yeah, look, I guess in terms of lowering the age to 16, I think what's more pressing on my mind, while that is an issue that people feel very passionately about, is the amount of, say, 18, 19-year-olds that aren't actually enrolled or are not turning out to vote. We see a large number of 18, 19, 20-year-olds that are not engaged. It's much lower than the general population of enrolment. So my focus would definitely be on how do we get those young people that are already old enough to vote that are not actually enrolled, how do we facilitate them enrolling, making them feel like it's worth their while, getting them to understand why it's really important, and then how we move forward from there. So for me, I think this is really the key pressing priority of those that are old enough to vote not actually taking that opportunity. Why is that not, and how can we facilitate it?
Thanks, Amanda. And for anyone that's watching that is 16, you can already enroll. Go and do it now. Do it all the time. It's a really important thing to do. Can't vote till you're 18. You can't vote this Saturday, but go and enroll now for next time. Amanda, we've almost got all of these under 45 minutes, so I'm keen to wrap up pretty soon for everyone. And I know you've got a really busy couple of days ahead of you. Could you just share for everyone watching what you would say to young people heading into the polls a couple of days just before they go in?
Well, firstly, your vote matters. I'll start with that. Your vote matters. And so whoever you vote for, please vote, number one. But secondly, I hope you will consider a vote for Labor. Look, I feel very, very passionately about engaging with young people and being an advocate for young people. And so I hope that's come across tonight. And look, really committed, if I'm the Minister for Youth, with working with you all about how we do deliver a better future for young people, but for all Australians. I mean, Anthony Albanese has a really good saying, and I take it all the time. We don't want to hold people back, but we don't want people left behind. And that in essence is what we want to do as if we're the party of government.
Thanks, Amanda. Again, we really appreciate you coming tonight. We really appreciate your support for AYAC, and I hope everyone's really enjoyed this series of forums over the last week and a half during a really long election campaign. That's it for this evening. We're going to leave you with that. Final thing is, if you'd like to join AYAC and find out more about our other events and everything else that we do and a little bit more about the election, you can join AYAC in the link at the chat or by going to ayac.org.au. We also really appreciate hearing feedback about our events, and we'll share a link in the chat which you can stay in below. But otherwise, thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks, Caitlin. Everyone, please go out and vote. It'll open on Saturday. Otherwise, thanks again and have a great night.